the sound in the walls. Sarah lived alone in an old Victorian house. It was a beautiful place, with creaky floorboards and stained glass windows. But it was also a place of shadows and whispers. She'd moved in after a painful breakup, seeking solitude and a fresh start. But the house seemed to have other plans. At first, it was just the creaks and groans of an aging building. The wind whistling through the chimney sounded like mournful wails. The old house settled with a series of pops and cracks that echoed through the night. But then, something changed. A soft scratching sound began to emanate from the walls. At first, she thought it was mice, but the sound was too consistent, too rhythmic. It was as if something was moving behind the plaster, tiny claws scraping against the wood. She tried to ignore it, to convince herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the sound grew louder, more insistent. Days turned into nights filled with terror. She would lie in bed, eyes wide open, listening to the scratching. Sometimes it seemed to follow her from room to room. It would start softly, a distant whisper, then grow louder and louder until it felt like it was right next to her. She called in an exterminator, but he found no evidence of rodents. The house was inspected for structural damage, but nothing was found. The scratching continued, a relentless, maddening presence. Sarah started to see shadows moving in the corners of her vision, figures that seemed to flicker and disappear. She'd catch glimpses of them out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned, there was nothing there. The scratching evolved. It became more complex, almost like a coded message. There were pauses, variations in rhythm. It was as if something was trying to communicate with her. She started to believe it was alive, intelligent. Paranoia set in. She checked every corner of the house, looking for signs of an intruder. She slept with a knife under her pillow, ready to defend herself. But there was no one there, just the house and the sound. The scratching began to take on a human quality. It sounded like someone was trying to speak, their voice muffled by the wall. She could hear words forming, but they were garbled, incomprehensible. One night, as she lay in bed, paralyzed by fear, she heard a new sound. It was a soft knocking, coming from the wall next to her bed. Her heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the wall vibrating. And then, a voice, clear and distinct, whispered her name. Sarah screamed. Sarah's scream echoed through the empty house, a desperate plea for help. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to vibrate through her bones. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped her heart. She pulled the covers over her head, but the darkness was no protection. The house seemed to change. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a sinister underbelly. Shadows danced in grotesque patterns on the walls. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. A foul odor, like rotting flesh, filled the room. Days turned into a blur of terror. Sarah existed in a state of constant fear. She barely ate, her body trembling with each passing hour. The scratching continued, more insistent than ever. The voice that whispered her name became a constant companion, a mocking whisper in the darkness. One night, the scratching stopped. A silence fell over the house, a heavy, oppressive silence. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears. She was alone, or so she thought. Then a creak from the floorboards. A shadow moved across the wall, long and sinister. A figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall and gaunt, with eyes that glowed an eerie blue. Its skin was pale and translucent, and its hands were long and claw-like. The creature moved towards her, its steps slow and deliberate. Sarah froze, unable to move. The creature stopped in front of her bed, its face inches from hers. Its eyes bored into her soul, and she felt a cold emptiness spreading through her. Then it spoke. "You are mine," it whispered, its voice like ice. A wave of nausea washed over Sarah. She felt herself slipping away, fading into darkness. As consciousness slipped from her grasp, she heard the creature laugh, a chilling sound that echoed through the house. Sarah awoke with a jolt, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was bathed in an eerie, moonlight glow. The creature was gone. A cold sweat broke out on her skin as she scanned the room, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. She was alone, or so it seemed. A strange sensation crept over her, a feeling of detachment, as if she were watching herself from outside her body. She looked down at her hands, and they seemed unfamiliar, almost translucent. A wave of terror washed over her as she realized she was changing. Her body felt cold and numb, and she could feel a strange energy coursing through her veins. The scratching started again, but this time, it was inside her head. A voice, cold and distant, spoke to her, telling her to embrace the darkness, to become one with the house. The voice was familiar, the same voice that had whispered her name. Resistance was futile. The darkness consumed her, pulling her into a void of nothingness. As she slipped away, she saw a reflection of herself in the mirror. Her eyes glowed an eerie blue, just like the creatures. She was no longer Sarah. She was something else entirely. Sarah awoke to a world transformed. The house, once a comforting sanctuary, was now a sinister entity, its walls pulsating with a dark energy. She was no longer human. Her body felt alien, a vessel for something ancient and evil. Her reflection in the mirror was a grotesque caricature of her former self. Her skin was pale and translucent, with veins of dark, inky blackness winding beneath the surface. Her eyes, once a warm brown, now glowed with an unnatural blue light. The voice in her head, the voice of the house, was constant, a relentless whisper urging her forward. She was no longer afraid. Fear had been replaced by a cold, detached indifference. She was a creature of the night, a predator stalking the darkness. The house was her domain, and she was its queen. She began to explore the house with a new perspective. Hidden passages and secret rooms revealed themselves, filled with strange artifacts and occult symbols. The house was alive, a sentient being with a dark purpose, and she was its chosen instrument. As days turned into nights, Sarah's transformation accelerated. Her body grew stronger, her senses sharpened. She developed an uncanny ability to sense the presence of others, even those hidden in the shadows. The voice in her head grew louder, more insistent, revealing dark secrets about the house and its history. She discovered that the house had been built on an ancient burial ground, a place of dark power. The creatures that lived within the walls were not of this world. They were ancient, malevolent entities that had been trapped for centuries. And now they were free. Sarah was their queen, their conduit to the world of the living. She was tasked with a terrible purpose: to spread darkness, to corrupt the minds of others, to create an army of the undead.
The crawling within. The house was old, its bones creaking in protest against the world outside. Sarah had always loved the creaks, the whispers of the house settling into itself. But now they were different. They were alive. The first sign was a small, red bump on her arm. It itched, a maddening itch that she scratched until it bled. It healed quickly, leaving a faint scar. Then came the others, spreading like a dark vine across her skin. They were itchy, painful, and growing. At night, she'd wake to an unbearable sensation. Something was moving beneath her skin, a tiny, insistent scratching. It was like a colony of insects, burrowing deeper and deeper. Panic would grip her as she tried to claw at her skin, to rip open the infected flesh. But there was nothing there, just smooth skin and the phantom itch. Fear gnawed at her. She isolated herself, the world becoming a blur of shadows and the constant, creeping sensation. The mirrors became her enemy, reflecting a body marred by red, swollen bumps. Her reflection was a stranger, a monstrous caricature of herself. Days turned into a haze of pain medication and paranoia. The house seemed to close in around her, the creaks morphing into sinister laughter. Shadows danced on the walls, taking grotesque shapes. Her mind was a battlefield, logic and terror locked in a desperate struggle. Then the changes began. Her nails grew long and sharp, curved like talons. Her teeth ached with a pressure that was almost pleasurable, as if something was pushing from within. Her hair, once soft and brown, was now a matted, oily black. The crawling sensation intensified. It was no longer just beneath her skin, but inside her head, in her chest, everywhere. She could feel them multiplying, growing stronger. Her body was becoming a breeding ground for something alien, something terrifying. One night, as she lay in bed, the darkness seemed to press in on her. A low, guttural growl echoed through the house, a sound that was both inside and outside her. Fear turned to acceptance as she realized what was happening. She was becoming it. The transformation was agonizing. Her bones cracked and shifted, her body contorting into unnatural shapes. The ceiling seemed to lower, pressing down on her with crushing force. And then, the final breakthrough. Something burst forth from her chest, a wet, glistening mass that writhed and pulsed with a sickening vitality. As consciousness slipped away, she felt a sense of peace. The crawling was over. The thing inside her was free. And in that moment of surrender, she realized that the horror was not just in what she was becoming, but in the realization that it was, in some twisted way, a part of her. Sarah awoke to a world transformed. Her body was a grotesque caricature of its former self. Her skin was stretched tight, a sickly green hue replacing her natural color. Her eyes, once a warm brown, were now black pits, devoid of life. And the creature, the thing that had emerged from her chest, was gone. A cold dread settled over her. She was alone with this new, abhorrent form. The house, once comforting, was now a prison. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows more menacing than ever. She moved with a newfound, unnatural grace, her body fluid and sinuous. The world seemed slowed down, as if seen through thick water. Sounds were amplified, the creak of the house a deafening cacophony. Smells, once familiar and comforting, were now overwhelming, a nauseating assault on her senses. Hunger gnawed at her, a primal urge that consumed her thoughts. She stumbled to the kitchen, drawn by a faint scent. A half-eaten apple lay on the counter. With a revulsion she couldn't understand, she lunged at it, her teeth sinking into the fruit with a sickening crunch. The taste was metallic, and as she chewed, she felt something change within her. A warmth spread through her body, a sense of satisfaction. Days turned into nights in a blur of feeding and endless wandering. She explored the house, discovering hidden corners and forgotten spaces. In the attic, she found an old, leather-bound book. The pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams, and as she stared at them, a connection formed, a resonance deep within her being. The book spoke of a hidden world, a place beyond the veil of human perception. It spoke of creatures like her, beings born from the shadows, creatures of pure instinct and insatiable hunger. It was a world of darkness and horror, but also of power. As she delved deeper into the book, changes began to occur. Her senses sharpened, her strength increased. The world outside the house became a temptation, a vast, unexplored territory filled with potential prey. One night, driven by an irresistible urge, she ventured outside. The world was different now, seen through the eyes of a predator. Shadows were alive, filled with the promise of sustenance. The moon cast an eerie glow, illuminating a world transformed into a hunting ground. As she moved through the night, a new confidence grew within her. She was no longer Sarah, the frightened woman. She was something else, something terrifying and powerful. And as she stalked her prey, a thrill of anticipation coursed through her veins. The hunt had begun. The night was alive with the scent of fear. A small town, nestled in the heart of rural America, was unaware of the predator stalking its streets. Sarah moved like a shadow, her senses heightened, her body a lethal weapon. She tasted the air, a cocktail of human fear and animal instinct. Her prey was a young couple, lost in the intoxicating haze of youth. They walked hand in hand, oblivious to the darkness that crept closer. A flicker of fear sparked in the man's eyes as he glanced over his shoulder. Sarah froze, her predatory instincts honed in on his terror. It was a game, a dance of hunter and prey. She let them walk a little further, savoring the anticipation. Then she struck. With a speed that defied human comprehension, she was upon them. A scream tore from the woman's lips, a sound that was both horrifying and exhilarating. The man fought, but his struggles were futile against her inhuman strength. The night was filled with the sounds of their terror, a symphony of fear that was music to her ears. When it was over, the night was silent. The couple was gone, consumed by the darkness. Sarah stood amidst the remnants of her feast, a sense of satisfaction washing over her. She was a predator, pure and simple, and she was thriving. As dawn approached, she retreated to the old house. The book, her guide to this new world, held promises of even greater power. She turned its pages, her mind racing. There were others like her, creatures of the night. A world of darkness awaited, a world where she belonged. Days turned into weeks. She became a phantom, a shadow that moved through the night. Her legend grew, whispered in hushed tones. People called her the Night Crawler, a creature of myth and terror. But she was more than that. She was a survivor, an evolution, a predator at the top of the food chain. And as she looked out at the world, a world trembling in fear, she felt a sense of power she had never known. This was her domain, and she was queen.
The quiet man. John lived alone in a small, quiet town. People knew little about him. He was a recluse, a man of shadows, always seen alone, always silent. Some said he was a writer, others a painter. No one knew for sure, but there was an unsettling aura around him, a quiet dread that made people avoid him. One foggy morning, John's door creaked open. A young woman, Emily, stood there, her face pale and drawn. Lost, she explained. She had been driving when the fog thickened, and she'd missed a turn. John, with a nod, invited her in. Emily was drawn to John's house. It was old, filled with strange objects and an odd, musty smell. Yet, there was a warmth to it, a homely feel that soothed her. Days turned into weeks as the fog persisted. Emily, unable to find her way back, stayed. As days passed, Emily noticed strange things. Shadows seemed to dance in the corner of her eyes, whispers echoed in the silent house, and at night, she'd wake up to the sound of footsteps pacing outside her door. John seemed oblivious to these disturbances. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Emily asked about the house. John's eyes, usually dull, sparked with an eerie light. He spoke of the house not as a building but as a living entity, a being that chose its inhabitants, that fed on their fears. Fear gnawed at Emily. She started seeing things, or perhaps imagining them. Faces in the wallpaper, eyes in the shadows. The house seemed to close in around her, its walls whispering secrets. John, far from being a comforting presence, became a looming shadow, his silence more terrifying than any scream. Then came the nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams that bled into reality. She'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, the house seeming to close in on her. John would be there, his eyes filled with a strange, knowing look. Emily realized she was trapped. Trapped in a house, trapped in her mind, and trapped in a growing madness. The line between reality and illusion blurred, and she couldn't tell what was real anymore. One night, as a particularly terrifying dream ended, Emily found herself standing in the hallway. The house was silent, too silent. A cold dread washed over her. She called out for John, but there was no answer. A door at the end of the hallway creaked open. Light spilled out, casting eerie shadows. With trembling steps, Emily walked towards it. The room was filled with books, paintings, and strange objects. At the center, a large canvas stood, covered with a black cloth. A cold hand touched her shoulder. She whirled around, expecting to see John. Instead, she saw her own reflection, distorted and terrifying. The eyes in the reflection were not hers. They were black, empty, and filled with a cold, inhuman intelligence. A scream tore from her throat as the reflection reached out, its hand passing through her own. She felt a cold emptiness spreading through her body, a numbing sensation that crept up her spine. The last thing Emily saw was the black cloth falling from the canvas, revealing a painting of herself, but with the same black, empty eyes. And then darkness. The house stood silent, the only sound the ticking of an old grandfather clock. John walked into the room, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. He looked at the painting, then at the empty space where Emily had stood. "Another one," he whispered, his voice carrying a strange echo in the silent house. Outside, the fog rolled in, thick and impenetrable. The house on the hill stood alone, a dark silhouette against the ghostly white. And within its walls, a sinister game continued, a game as old as the house itself, a game where the only winner was the house. The disappearance of Emily sent shockwaves through the quiet town. People talked in hushed tones about the eerie house on the hill. Some said they had seen shadows moving behind the windows. Others claimed to hear mournful wails in the dead of night. The local police, despite their skepticism, felt a creeping unease as they investigated the house. Inside, the house seemed to have reverted to its original state. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. It was as if Emily had simply vanished into thin air. The only anomaly was the painting in the attic, a chilling portrait of Emily with those vacant, black eyes. Detective Harris, the lead investigator, was a man of science, not superstition. Yet, as he stood in that room, a chill ran down his spine. There was something profoundly unsettling about the painting, something that seemed to draw him in and repel him at the same time. Days turned into weeks, and the case went cold. But Detective Harris couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. He started having strange dreams, dreams of the house on the hill, of shadows and whispers, of Emily's terrified face. He decided to spend a night in the house, a decision that his colleagues warned him against. Armed with a flashlight and a recorder, he entered the house. The moment he stepped inside, a cold draft swept through the room, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. As the night wore on, the house seemed to come alive. Strange noises echoed through the corridors. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision. He heard whispers, soft at first, then growing louder, filling the house with an eerie cacophony. Then he saw it. A figure, translucent and ethereal, stood at the foot of the stairs. It was Emily, or at least a ghostly resemblance of her. Her eyes, the same vacant black, stared into his soul. A scream built in his throat, but no sound escaped his lips. He tried to move, to flee, but his body refused to obey. He was frozen in terror, a helpless spectator to his own nightmare. Then the figure began to move towards him, its translucent form shimmering in the dim light. Detective Harris woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The house was silent, the morning sun streaming through the windows. It was a dream, he told himself, a product of a tired mind. But as he looked around the room, he saw it. A small, black stain on the wall, shaped like a hand. Fear gnawed at him. He had to get out of there. He packed his belongings and left the house, never to return. But the house on the hill continued to cast a long shadow over the town. People avoided it, their fear growing with each passing day. Years later, the house was demolished. But the stories persisted, whispered in hushed tones around campfires. A chilling tale of a house that was more than just bricks and mortar. They said that on foggy nights, you can still see the shadows of the house. And if you listen carefully, you can hear the faint whisper of a name lost to time, a name that echoes through the darkness. Emily, or whatever she had become, was just one victim of the house. There were others, they said, people who had disappeared without a trace, their souls trapped within the house's sinister embrace. The house on the hill was a place of shadows, a place where sanity went to die, a place where fear was the only constant.